My family treated me like the disappointment for 11 years because I'm the only one without a degree. They just found out I own the building my sister's office is in. I graduated from high school and went straight to work because my parents told me they could only afford to send 2 kids to college and Pam and Reggie had better grades. That's what they said. Better grades. I had a B average. Pam had an A minus and Reggie had a B plus. The difference between Reggie and me was half a letter grade, and that half a letter grade decided my entire future, according to my parents. I didn't argue. I got a job at a hardware store the week after graduation, and I worked. I learned everything I could about the business. I learned inventory, ordering, vendor relationships, pricing, how to manage a floor, how to deal with contractors, all of it. By the time I was 22, I was running the store. The owner was an older guy named Milt who didn't have kids and treated me like I was his. He taught me about the books, about margins, about how to keep a business alive when the big box stores were trying to crush everyone. I worked for Milt for 8 years, and during that time I saved everything I could because I lived small and I didn't have student loans eating my paycheck every month like Pam and Reggie did. My family never asked about my work. At every gathering, the conversation was always about degrees and careers and accomplishments that came with a diploma attached. Pam would talk about her MBA and how she was moving up at her consulting firm, and my parents would beam. Reggie would talk about his policy work, and my father would nod like he was listening to a senator. When I tried to say anything about the store or something I learned that week, the conversation would just stop. Not a pause, a full stop. Like I had interrupted something important with something that didn't count. My mother would smile politely and then turn to someone else and say so anyway. My father would look at his plate. Pam would wait until I finished talking and then pick up right where she left off like I hadn't said a word. Reggie at least had the decency to look uncomfortable about it, but he never once said, "Hey, let her finish." I stopped trying after a while. I'd sit at holiday dinners and eat and listen to everyone talk about their world, and I'd go home and sit in my apartment and wonder why I wasn't enough. Every Thanksgiving, my aunt would ask me if I had thought about going back to school. Every Christmas, my mother would give me a brochure for a community college and say it's never too late. One year, Pam told me about an opening at her firm for an administrative position and said I could work my way up. I told her I already ran a store and she said yes, but that's retail. She said it like it was a disease. When Milt decided to retire, he sat me down in his office and told me he wanted to sell me the store. He gave me a number that was well below market value because he said I had earned it. I used every dollar I had saved plus a small business loan and I bought it. I was 29 and I owned a business. I didn't tell my family for 3 months because I knew what they'd say. When I finally mentioned it at Sunday dinner, my father said that's nice and then asked Reggie about his new position. My mother said she hoped I had a backup plan. Over the next 5 years, I grew that store into something real. I expanded the inventory, built relationships with every contractor in the area, and opened a second location on the other side of town. I was pulling in more money than I ever thought I'd see, and I started putting it into property. Milt had taught me that real estate was where working people built wealth, and I listened. I bought a small commercial building that had 3 units in it. I fixed it up and rented all 3. Then I bought another one, then a third. By the time I was 35, I owned 4 commercial properties and 2 stores, and I had more money in the bank than anyone in my family knew about. I never talked about it because nobody ever asked. At every gathering, the conversation was still about degrees and careers, and I was still the one who got smiled at and skipped over. My mother still left community college brochures on my windshield when she visited. Pam still spoke to me in that tone like she was explaining something to a child who couldn't keep up. Last Thanksgiving, Pam was talking about her firm moving to a new office space. She said they had found a great building downtown and signed a lease, and that she was handling the transition. She was going on about square footage and the conference rooms and how the landlord had renovated the whole thing recently. My mother was nodding along like Pam was describing something historic. I asked what building. Pam said the address. I put my fork down. It was my building, the one I had bought 2 years earlier and spent 4 months renovating with my own contractor crew. Pam's firm was renting from me. She had no idea. I didn't say anything that night. I let her finish talking, and I ate my pie, and I went home. About a month later, I got a call from Pam's office manager about a maintenance request. A pipe in the second-floor bathroom was leaking. I told my property manager to handle it and CC me on everything. The next day, Pam called me. She said the property manager had listed my name as the building owner on the work order. She said, "Is this a joke?" I said, "No, that's my building." She got very quiet. I sat in my apartment that night and played the phone call over and over in my head. Pam's voice had that weird crack in it when she asked if it was a joke, like she couldn't decide if she was mad or confused or embarrassed. I sat on my couch with the TV on mute and tried to figure out what I actually wanted to happen next. Part of me felt good about it, that quiet kind of satisfaction you get when something you've been holding finally gets seen. But it wasn't simple like that. This changed everything between us. I could use it as leverage, tell her the rent was going up, or that I needed to rethink the lease terms. I could make her squirm the way I'd squirmed at every family dinner for the past 11 years. Or I could demand the apology I'd never gotten. Or I could just let it sit there between us, like the elephant that would follow us into every room from now on. 2 days later, Pam's name showed up on my phone. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Her voice was careful careful and measured, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. She wanted to meet for coffee to discuss the building situation. That's exactly how she said it. The building situation. Corporate speak for, she needed to know if I was going to raise her rent or kick her firm out. I told her I could do Saturday morning, and she said that worked. And then there was this pause where neither of us knew how to end the call. I spent the next 3 days thinking about what I actually wanted from the conversation. I wanted her to see me differently, but I didn't know if that was even possible. I wanted her to understand what the past 11 years had felt like, but I couldn't figure out how to make someone understand something they'd never bothered to notice. Saturday morning, I showed up at the coffee shop 10 minutes early and got a table in the back corner. Pam walked in exactly on time wearing jeans and a sweater, which was weird because I usually only saw her in work clothes at family dinners. She got a latte and sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around the cup like she needed something to hold on to. The whole thing was awkward as hell. She kept trying to steer the conversation toward business terms, talking about lease agreements and maintenance schedules and tenant relations. She was dancing around the actual issue so hard I could practically see the steps. I let her go on for about 10 minutes, and then I just cut through it. I told her the lease terms weren't changing, and her firm was a good tenant, and she had nothing to worry about on that front. I watched her shoulders drop about 2 inches, and her whole face changed. Then I asked her directly if she understood why I didn't tell the family about my properties. She got quiet in a way that made me think she was actually thinking about it for the first time. She admitted she never really asked me about my work, because she assumed retail management was straightforward and not particularly interesting. She said it just like that, no sugarcoating, which was something, I guess. It stung to hear out loud, but at least it was honest. She said she was processing the fact that I owned the building and 3 others, that I'd apparently been more successful than any of them realized while they were all busy talking about their careers. She said processing like it was a computer running a program. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and drank my coffee and let the silence stretch out. She asked me how long I'd owned the properties, and I told her the timeline, about buying the first building 5 years ago and growing from there. She kept shaking her head like she couldn't make the numbers fit with her mental picture of me. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, and then she said she needed to get going. When we stood up to leave, she touched my arm and said she was glad we talked and that she wanted to do better. I told her okay and walked to my car and sat there for a few minutes before I started the engine. 3 days later, Mom called. I could tell Pam had told her about the building because Mom's voice had that forced, cheerful tone she uses when she's scrambling to fix something. She wanted to have a family dinner this weekend. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just dinner. I knew exactly what this was. Damage control. The family trying to figure out how to handle the information that I wasn't the failure they'd decided I was. I agreed because I was curious and because part of me had been waiting 11 years for this exact moment. Saturday evening, I drove to my parents' house and parked on the street. Reggie's car was already there, and so was Pam's. Mom opened the door before I could knock and pulled me into a hug that lasted too long. Dad shook my hand and asked about traffic. Pam was helping set the table, and Reggie was opening wine. Everyone was being so aggressively polite it made my teeth hurt. The whole meal was the most uncomfortable thing I'd ever sat through, and that included the year Reggie brought home his girlfriend who didn't eat meat or dairy or gluten, and Mom had to make 3 separate dishes. Everyone kept asking me questions about the properties, but it felt like they were reading from a script. Dad asked about my real estate portfolio like he'd practiced saying the words. Mom wanted to know about expansion plans. I answered everything, but I could see them struggling, especially Dad. He kept looking at me like he was trying to match up what I was saying with his mental image of me as the kid who got passed over for half a letter grade. After dinner, Reggie pulled me aside in the hallway. He said he wanted to apologize for never speaking up when they talked over me. He said he always felt guilty about getting the college funding over me for half a letter grade, that he was 18 and didn't know how to push back against their decision. It wasn't enough to fix anything, but it was the first genuine acknowledgement I'd gotten from anyone in this family. I told him I appreciated it. He asked if we could grab lunch sometime, just the 2 of us, and I said, yeah. 2 weeks later, I was at the store doing inventory when Lucas, my property manager, called about a significant plumbing issue in Pam's building. It would require shutting off water to the 2nd floor for 2 days. Pam's firm was on the 2nd floor. The pipe had been slowly leaking inside the wall for who knows how long, and now it needed major work. He could get a crew in fast, but it would cost extra, or we could wait for the standard timeline and save the money. Pam's firm was in the middle of a big project week, and losing water for 2 days would really mess them up. I stood there in the middle of my store and realized this was the first real test of whether I could separate business from family resentment. I could stick to the standard timeline and save money and tell myself it was just business, or I could expedite it and know I was doing it because it was Pam. I told Lucas to approve the expedited repairs. I said it was the right business decision because keeping good tenants happy was worth the extra cost. I said it fast before I could second-guess myself. Lucas said he'd handle all the coordination with Pam's office manager, and I told him to keep me CC'd on everything, but I was staying out of it otherwise. He got the crew in there that afternoon, and they had the water back on in 36 hours instead of 2 days. Pam texted me afterward thanking me for prioritizing the repair. I responded with a simple no problem and left it at that. that. I wasn't ready to pretend we were suddenly close siblings who texted about life. I wasn't ready for a lot of things, but I also didn't want to be the kind of person who used property ownership as a weapon. That felt important, even if I couldn't explain exactly why. Tuesday evening, I was in my apartment making dinner when someone knocked on my door. Mom was standing there holding a casserole dish. She walked in without waiting for an invitation and went straight to my kitchen. She put the casserole on the counter and said she wanted to have an overdue conversation. She sat down at my kitchen table, and I sat across from her and waited. She started explaining how they handled the college decision, how Pam and Reggie's higher GPAs seemed like better investments, how they had to make a choice with limited money, how they thought they were setting everyone up for success. She talked about return on investment and graduation rates and career trajectories. She never once said she was sorry. She never once acknowledged that maybe grades weren't the only thing that mattered. She just kept explaining the math, like, if I understood the numbers, I'd understand why they picked my siblings over me. And I realized, sitting there listening to her, that she still didn't get it. She thought this was about money, or college, or degrees. She didn't understand it was about 11 years of being invisible in my own family. She didn't understand it was about being dismissed and talked over and treated like I'd failed at life because I took a different path. She was still framing it as a financial calculation rather than a fundamental rejection. I looked at her sitting at my kitchen table waiting for me to understand her logic, and I realized she was never going to say she was sorry because she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She thought this conversation was about explaining the past, so I'd stop being upset about it. I interrupted her mid-sentence and told her the issue wasn't the money or the decision itself. I said it was the 11 years after that, where she dismissed everything I accomplished because it didn't come with a degree. She said they were always proud of me working hard. The word proud came out automatic, like she'd rehearsed it. I asked her when she ever showed that pride. I pointed out that being talked over at every family gathering for over a decade doesn't feel like pride. I told her pride and respect are different things, and I never got the second one. She stared at her hands on my table for a long time, and then said she needed to think about that. She left without finishing her explanation, and I sat in my kitchen wondering if anything would actually change. 3 weeks later, I was at my cousin's birthday party at a restaurant downtown when the aunt cornered me near the bathroom. She had that excited look people get when they want gossip confirmed. She asked if it was true about the properties, and I knew the family network had been busy spreading the news. Her sudden interest was almost funny, because 3 months ago at Christmas, she'd handed me a brochure for online degree programs. She'd done it every year like clockwork. Now she was standing too close asking how many buildings I owned and what areas they were in. I gave her the basic facts: 4 commercial properties, 2 hardware stores, downtown and west side locations. She asked what the properties were worth, and I told her I didn't discuss specific numbers. She said she'd always known I was smart with money. I almost laughed because she'd spent 11 years suggesting I go back to school to make something of myself. I excused myself after 5 minutes because I couldn't handle the revisionist history she was spinning. 4 months after the plumbing incident, Pam's firm wanted to renew their lease early with an option to expand into the 3rd unit. I realized she was trying to build a more stable relationship with me as her landlord. This was probably the closest she could get to acknowledging she'd misjudged me for 11 years, doing it through business terms because that was her language. I approved the renewal because it made good business sense and sent the documents back through Lucas without making a big deal about it. Thanksgiving felt different from the moment I walked in. I brought 2 pies like always, but this time when I talked about a contractor issue, Dad actually asked follow-up questions. Pam asked about my 2nd store location. Reggie mentioned an article about small business growth. The aunt didn't mention college once, which might have been the biggest change of all. I caught Mom watching me talk with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't pride exactly. It looked more like she was seeing me for the first time. 6 weeks later, the local Chamber of Commerce asked me to speak about small business growth. The presentation went well, and afterward, 3 different people asked for my contact information. Then, the regional newspaper called wanting a feature for their business section. The reporter interviewed me for an hour about Milt and the early years and how I built everything. One of my longtime contractor friends texted me the article when it came out with about 15 fire emojis. I read it twice sitting in my truck outside the store. I felt proud of what I'd built, regardless of who in my family read it. The professional respect I'd built in my actual community mattered more than my family's late recognition. Pam texted me a photo of the newspaper page with the article circled in red pen. Her message said, "I read this twice and I'm really impressed. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what you've been building." It wasn't a full apology for 11 years, but it was more emotional honesty than she'd ever offered. I responded thanking her and suggesting coffee soon. I meant it. 2 months later, I was reviewing property listings with Lucas when I saw a small mixed-use building for sale 3 blocks from my downtown location. Retail space on the ground floor and 4 apartments above. The price was reasonable and the location was solid. I ran the numbers and called my bank about financing. Lucas was excited about managing another property and started talking about potential tenants before I'd even made an offer. I realized, sitting there, that I was making this decision purely for business growth rather than to prove anything to my family. The shift felt significant. For the first time in my adult life, my success was completely separate separate from their validation. I didn't need them to understand what I was building because I understood it. 3 weeks before Christmas, Dad called and asked if he could visit one of my stores to see the operation. He'd never asked to see where I worked in 16 years. He showed up at 9 in the morning and spent 2 hours watching me work with customers and contractors. He asked about inventory systems and vendor relationships and how I built the contractor community. It was awkward because we'd never spent time like this, just the two of us in my world, but he seemed genuinely interested. I hosted a celebration at my original store for its 15th anniversary in January and invited family alongside my contractors and vendors and regular customers. They all showed up. Watching them interact with the people who'd respected my work for years created a strange collision of worlds. Pam talked shop with my commercial clients. Reggie spent 20 minutes talking to my plumber about city regulations. Mom stood near the refreshment table looking uncomfortable until one of my regular customers started telling her how much the neighborhood appreciated the store. Then Milt's widow came over and told Mom how proud Milt was of me and how he used to say I had better business sense than anyone he'd ever met. Mom's eyes filled up and she excused herself to the bathroom. When she came back, she looked at me different from she ever had before. About 2 weeks after the anniversary party, Reggie called me on a Tuesday night and said he needed to tell me something. He'd been at the aunt's holiday party the weekend before, and apparently she'd made some comment about different kinds of success while looking pointedly at him and Pam. He said he shut it down immediately by pointing out I was the most financially successful person in our generation of the family, and the aunt had gotten quiet and changed the subject. I thanked him for saying something, and he told me he should have been doing it for years. It was a small thing, but having someone actually stand up for me in family conversations felt new. I'd spent so long being the one who got dismissed that having an ally, even just Reggie, made those gatherings feel less like something I had to endure alone. Pam and I met for coffee again in early December, and this time she said it wasn't about the building or business. She admitted she'd bought into the family narrative that college equals success and never questioned whether that was fair. She said watching me at the anniversary party, seeing how respected I was by everyone there, made her realize she'd been wrong about a lot of things. I told her I didn't need her to feel guilty forever, but I did need her to see me as an equal going forward. She said that was reasonable and overdue, and for the first time in years, we talked like siblings, instead of like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. Christmas dinner felt different this year. I talked about a property management challenge and people actually listened. Dad asked follow-up questions and then told me his friend was having issues with a tenant and wanted my advice. He was treating me like an expert instead of the family disappointment, and while the shift wasn't dramatic or perfect, it was real. I realized halfway through dinner that I wasn't sitting there waiting to be talked over anymore because I'd stopped expecting them to validate me. On a quiet Sunday in January, I sat in my apartment reviewing the books for all my properties. The numbers were solid across the board. I looked at the spreadsheets showing 16 years of work from that first hardware store job to 2 successful locations and 5 commercial properties, and I realized I'd built exactly the life I wanted, regardless of how long it took my family to notice. They were treating me better now, and some relationships were genuinely improving, but the real victory was that I didn't need their approval anymore to know my worth. Milt had taught me that success is what you build with your own hands, and looking at everything I'd created over 16 years, I finally understood he was right all along.